and welcome to a millinery block making video. My name is Ilona, I'm a milliner based in London, and today I'm going to show you how to use plaster to make hat blocks. In my how to block with buckram video, I mentioned that I was using a plaster block, and Aisha asked, can you show us how to make a DIY plaster block? And yes, Aisha, of course I can. I'm actually going to make a copy of Jackie Kennedy's 1961 inauguration hat, originally designed and made by Halston, for the simple reason that I want it, and so I shall have it. Once I've made the block, I'll also show you how to block with wool felt. It's easier than you think. Just remember, this is my preferred method. There is no right or wrong way, just whatever works for you. Let's gather the materials and get started. This net is available to download from my website. Follow the link in the description box below. It helps to have a husband who has a degree in 3D modelling. I'd like to thank Mr. Millinery for helping me out here. Step 1 is to visualise the 3D hat. Rather ironically for a milliner, I am much more comfortable in 2D rather than 3D, so this is the greatest challenge for me. The way I work around this is to create a 3D model in Blender so that I have a physical shape to play with rather than trying to imagine it all in my head. Blender is a free 3D modeling software with tons of tutorials on YouTube, so I'm not going to explain the ins and outs of what's going on here because you can find it elsewhere. But the basics are that you need two reference images, the base and the side view. Add a cylinder to your scene and manipulate it with loop cuts and the scale tool. Once that's done, export only 1/4 of it to a 3D papercraft model. Once you've got your net, you will need to print it off and assemble it. My original net has a base circumference of 50 centimeters, which is definitely too small, so I thought I'd try it out at 52, 54 and 55 centimeters. To resize the net, change the percentage size in the printer dialog box. You can use a simple ratio to figure this out. For example, if 50 centimeters is 100%, then 54 is 108%. To assemble the net, I'm using masking tape. Bear in mind, as this net is only 1/4 of the whole, the sections need to be stuck together in an alternate fashion. As in, a section with the printed side on the outside needs to join with a section where the printed side is on the inside. Here are all my paper mock-ups. The 50 centimeters is the net size, 54 centimeters is my head size. I've also made a 55 centimeter version just to see if I prefer it sitting over my ears or not. And then a 52 centimeter version, which is my favourite Pillbox circumference. To determine the size I wanted to go with, I had a look through some of Jackie's hats online through the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum archives. And I have deduced that Jackie's possible head size was 22 inches or 56 centimeters. Apparently the hat Halston made was too small for her, so if I was to stay true to that, I would have to make mine at 52 centimeters as my head size is 54. And yes, I know, my head is tiny. Now that I have my shape, I want to reinforce it by giving it a wire frame. I need to figure out what kind of pattern my wire will bend into to give it the most structure. The shape I have is a dome, so I'm going to give it 7 rings and then 4 quarter arcs. I was also going to add in 4 extra arcs, but I later decided that that was too much effort. To calculate the lengths of the rings and arcs, I printed off another net and measured along the relevant lines. Don't worry, this will make more sense when I show you the finished wire structure. Just keep watching. I'm going to be using galvanized wire for my rings, but this is much easier if you use cotton-covered millinery wire. Regardless of which wire I use, I'm measuring it on the inside, as later I will be filling the inside of the shape with the plaster. Once I've cut the wire, I need to take the spring out. If I was being super traditionalist, I would completely straighten the wire out of its curl and then re-bend it to the circular shape. But who's got time for this? I certainly don't, so I'm straightening it out just enough to make a nice oval that sits flat on the table. As I've been making my rings, I've been placing them over my paper model to double check that I've got the right size. For my arcs, I'm going to use millinery wire, just because I'm running out of the galvanized type. You can do the same, or carry on using the wire you were already using. With the millinery wire, I have to add 5 centimeters to each end so that I can join it using thread rather than a ferrule. I'll put a video on joining wire like this in the card at the top right. I'm bending the 5cm join to the sides. I've also made sure to remember which wire is going lengthwise or crosswise, as there is a difference. I've colour-coded mine using markers so that I don't get confused. For putting the wires together, it's going to be easier if I explain the general concept of how to make sure they are shaped correctly rather than take you through what I'm doing all the way through. Otherwise, this video will get very long and boring, and we haven't even got to the plaster bit yet. Using your paper mock-up or your extra printed piece, you will need to measure out every single segment and then transfer and mark those measurements onto the wire. And I'm not kidding here, every single segment. This is not the time for cutting corners. If you want a really well balanced and even shape, you need to measure and mark. Once that's done, it's time to join up. I'm going to start with the center top join for the arcs using a double threaded needle and making a cross one way, then the other way, and finishing it off with a knot. Next, I'm going to join the 5cm legs of these wires to the base ring. I'm using crisscross stitches like a usual hat wire join. After doing this, I realized that it would have been so much easier to attach these wires to the base first rather than joining them at the top. So if you try this, join the 5cm legs to the base ring first and then stitch the center top together. And now join the rest of the rings to the cross structure. Make sure the rings are on the inside of the cross wires. For extra security at the joins, I'm going to dab a little bit of glue on the threads. You can use either Yoo-Hoo, Super or E6000 glue. To finish the shape, I'm going to cover the wire using duct tape. I'm going to start by sticking tape to the outside using short 2cm wide strips. As I'm doing this, I'm making sure all the markings are matched up. Incidentally, you could do this with bias strips of buckram, but that will take ages to sew. Here's the finished shape side by side with the paper model. It should be sturdy enough to hold the plaster. At this point, you might decide you want to use expanding foam instead of plaster. I'll leave a link to my video on this in the card at the top right. Here are the tools and materials that you need for the plaster. Before pouring the plaster, I need to apply a release agent. There are lots of different commercially available ones specifically designed for use with plaster, but I'm using what I have to hand, which is Vaseline. I'm using a small rag cloth so that I don't get it all over my fingers and under my nails. Once again, safety is super important, so make sure you're wearing a respirator mask so as not to breathe in any plaster particles. You should also wear rubber or latex gloves to prevent your hands from drying out, and an apron. Remember, anything that comes into contact with the plaster should not be washed down the drain, as it will clog up. Oh, and obviously any equipment that touches the plaster will not be food safe again. So that's why I'm using plastic tubs and I've covered my scales in clingfilm. Keep in mind, not all plaster is the same quality. This is what out-of-date plaster looks like. See how quickly it's set? It also looks grainy and didn't mix well. On the other hand, this is my fresh plaster. Plaster is also known as plaster of Paris or gypsum. The mix ratios for my plaster are 100 grams of plaster to 75 milliliters of water. Your plaster may be different, so always follow the instructions on the back of the packet. After a few batches of experimentation, I discovered that for my purposes a ratio of 3:2 is better, so I'm mixing 150 grams of plaster to 100 milliliters of water. When mixing, always put the powder into the water, never the other way around. Once the powder is in, wait 30 seconds before mixing. Mixing with a plastic spoon is so much easier than chopsticks. Try to avoid air bubbles, but if you've got some on the surface after you've poured, then you can use isopropyl alcohol in a spray bottle to get rid of them. After pouring in a batch, I hold the shape for about 5 minutes and then put it on a support structure which looks like this. It's my crafting water jug and a plastic tub. The plaster sets in about 20 minutes and it gets hot as it does so. After 20 minutes is when I mix and pour my next batch. Coating the insides of my dome shape took 4 batches of 150 grams plus 2 batches of 100 grams. Now I need to mix up a few more batches to build up the sides until they are about 2 centimeters thick. To build up the sides, I am waiting for the plaster mix to thicken a bit and then spooning it onto the edges. This took 2 batches of 100 grams. I'm going to mix up one last batch of 150 grams and, while it's liquidy, I'm going to pour it into the center of the shape to smooth out any rough joins. Altogether, this shape used 1.15 kilograms of plaster and 767 milliliters of water. This now needs to sit for at least 48 hours to dry enough before demolding. Here's the graveyard of rubbish left behind. I'm not going to throw away any of the plastic tubs. Instead, the plaster just falls out of them and I'm going to store them away until the next time I need to mix plaster. It's now 2 days later and time to demold. This can be tricky and I found the only way to do this was to slightly destroy my mold in the process, which was a shame as I wanted to keep it so that if this went wrong I could recast the same shape. But never mind, here's to hoping I don't mess it up. Once out of the mold, I used the green side of a scouring sponge and some water to smooth out the surface of my plaster. This also has the added benefit of cleaning off any excess release agent. Once that's done, the plaster needs more time to fully dry out. For me, this took a whole week. A good way to know whether your plaster is dry is to touch it with your hands and also your cheek. If it feels cold, it's still drying. Once it feels the same as your room temperature, it's probably dry, but just to be sure, leave it for one more day. Ta-da! Here it is! You might have noticed that this isn't perfect. It has a few dents in it, but don't worry, we'll deal with those in a little bit. First, I'm going to sand it down very gently using some fine sandpaper. Please wear a face mask when you do this to ensure that you don't breathe in any plaster particles. I'm being very careful here not to alter the shape. My goal is to smooth it down just enough. Every now and again, I pause to look at and feel the block. Feeling for the smoothness can sometimes tell you more about the surface than just looking at it. Now that the sanding is done, let's work on those dents. I'm using some wood filler and a plastic card. It will be impossible for me to cover all the small dents, so I'm focusing only on the larger ones which could potentially cause a problem for me when blocking. If, upon using this block for the first time, I discover that some dents are imprinting onto my material, I'll just go in again with some more wood filler at that point. And then to the painting. Plaster is a porous material, meaning that it has little tiny holes in its structure. Think of it looking like a pumice stone under a microscope. To make this into a long-lasting hat block, we need to plug all those holes, first using paint and later using varnish or lacquer. I'm using some wall emulsion paint left over from my flat decorating project. This particular colour is called China Clay Mid by Little Green. I didn't end up using it on my wall as it was far too boring for that, but I think it's perfect for my elegant hat block. I'm doing 2 layers of this paint and I'm also painting the lip of the block, but I didn't bother with the insides. Before I do the varnish, I need to stick something to the inside of my block to pin into. I've found using rubber door seals works very well, as they are pre-glued with a strong enough substance to stick to the plaster. Other options are electrical wire or really thick rope. You can stick those in using a silicone seal that you would use in your bathroom or around windows. For this method, you will need a special tool to squeeze the silicone out of its case. Finally, it's time for the last step, the varnish. I think most modern woodblock makers use 5 layers, but I'm settling for just 3. You can use a spray or paint the varnish on with a brush, it really doesn't matter. Make sure when you apply the varnish that you are in a well-ventilated space. Remember to let it dry between layers and don't forget to also varnish the lip. Now that the block is done, let's use it. I wanted to use a similar material to what Halston used for Jackie's original hat. but I couldn't find out if it was wool felt or fur felt. I've settled on wool felt mainly because it's cheaper. Right now, it's still summer, which means that the choice of felt colours is not as vast as it is out of season. I ordered the only two options that I could find, which are these. This is a standard wool felt with the colour name Mouse, and this is a merino wool felt called Sand. Sand is a little on the green side of the beige spectrum, so not really what I want to go for. And Mouse is more brown than it is beige. But never mind, I'll work with what I have. Before blocking, I've taken the time to stiffen one. Maybe you'd like a video on that. Let me know in the comments below if that's the case. If I do this, I wonder if you can tell which one I've chosen to use. I went with the Mouse because it matches this vintage dress. Whereas the green beige Sand doesn't match any of the outfits that I own. So I've labelled it and I figured that I'll use it for something later on. If anything, I'm intrigued to see how the merino will behave in comparison to the plain wool. So I definitely have to find a use for it. Any ideas? What do you think? What would you do with the tinted green beige felt?
To the blocking. Have a look in the description box for the tools you need for blocking with wool felt. Some people say they find it harder to block with wool felt than fur felt. I personally don't think this should be the case. You just need to alter your technique. Wool is coarser than fur, and so your hood needs to be more saturated with a lot more steam. I used about 1.5 litres of water of steam for this hat. Be patient and let the hood take in at least 1 steamer's worth of water before you start. That's about 400 millilitres. To help it along, you can lightly mist the inside of your felt with a spray bottle. Don't be tempted to soak your hood in water. I've heard of people doing this with wool felt, but beware that direct contact between your stiffener and water can cause staining. Also, a safety warning, steam is hot, so don't let your hand or any other part of you for that matter get in its way. Now that the hood is saturated, it's time to put it on the block and pull. I've propped my block up on a jar to give it some stability and to give me some space to get my hands under it. Try to keep the centre of the hood at the centre of the block. Pull down at 4 opposite points. Once you think it's tight enough at the top, turn the block over and start pulling the edges of the hood towards the centre. If I find that the felt is not pulling easily enough, instead of trying to pull harder, I'll just add a little bit more steam to the area I'm pulling. And as I pull, I'm engaging my stomach muscles and pulling against them. I'm counting this as today's workout done. In fact, there's so much steam that I might as well be in a sauna too, so I've had the full gym experience. As for the pins, I'm essentially doing the exact same thing as I do with buckram, so I'll leave a link to that video in a card at the top right. Over here is what should be avoided. The felt isn't flat against the block. I'll have to take the pin out and re-stretch it. Once I'm happy with the shape, I need to brush the felt to give its nap a direction. This is an optional step, but I find that brushing gives hats an extra bit of class. I've decided to use a nylon bristle brush today as I found that my metal brush was too harsh and my natural brush didn't have any effect. I've also decided to point the nap radially out and down from the top centre point, but you could choose to go round horizontally in circles following the curvature of the block. I left the felt to dry for 24 hours, and now it's almost time to peel off. First, I need to mark out my cutting line and also my front and back. I'm using a sewing gauge set to 1.5 centimeters and some soap. I find that it's easier to cut the excess felt off before taking the felt off the block. To take the felt off, I'm using a bendy plastic corset bone and hooking it in between the felt and the cling film. There, it's off. Let's see how the shape looks. This video is getting rather long, so I'm going to use everybody's favourite unhelpful phrase from Victorian sewing manuals and say, finish it in the usual manner. That is to say, I've put in a wire, sewn in my curved petersham and my label. Then I've given it a hair comb at the front and one last brush, and now it's finally time to wear it. Thank you for sticking with me to the end of this complicated process. I hope you will now go forth and make your own Jackie domed pillbox. Join me next week when I'll be showing you how to channel Jackie Kennedy and style this type of hat. If you've enjoyed today's video, please like and subscribe. This really helps me grow and reach a larger audience. For more hat-related content, you can follow me on Instagram @Millinery.
Thank you so much for watching. See you next time. Bye. Oh dear. Oh dear. Oh, the killer clauses. We could do the Watusi while we're here. How are you? He really does want a grape. He wants a grape. And now he wants my tea. And now he wants